Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Olmo with Key Performance Ideas, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar all about EPMA from setup to tips and tricks. Today's webinar will be presented by Deanna Sunde. Deanna Sunde is an Oracle ACE Associate and Delivery Director for the West region. Deanna's experience encompasses over 16 years with Hyperion and 5 years with Oracle Financials, with industry focus in oil and gas, energy, insurance and financial services, health services, and entertainment. She holds an MBA in finance, a Bachelor's of Science in Economics, and is a former certified public accountant. Deanna is also a certified implementation specialist for Hyperion Planning and Essbase and is a leader in the Hyperion community. She is a frequent speaker at user group conferences and webcasts such as Oracle Open World, Kscope, Collaborate, OAUG Connection Point, and regional user groups throughout the United States. Thank you, Deanna, for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you all for attending this webinar. The agenda will be, I'll start by talking about EPMA in general, an introduction including reasons why you might want to implement EPMA, the future of EPMA, some pros and cons between EPMA and classic applications, and EPMA versus DRM, and some design considerations. Then we'll talk about the shared library and the local library, and then how to load metadata, some tips, tricks, and some other aspects of how you would upgrade from Classic to EPMA. So here are some reasons for why you might want to use EPMA. EPMA provides the ability to share dimensions across your EPM applications. It's easier to manage hierarchies in one location by using EPMA. It also provides additional flexibility, as hierarchies can be sourced from other systems such as data warehouses or DRM, and it also allows for automation of loading your metadata and updating it. It's also very easy to migrate from Classic to EPMA. So the future of EPMA, right now Oracle is not doing any further development or enhancements to EPMA, but they are still supporting it. So there's been no announcement as to any date when it might be discontinued. EPMA, however, is not part of PBCS or EPBCS or the other cloud applications, and also is not on the roadmap. And EPMA also is not compatible with hybrid applications, so these are just some things that you want to keep in mind if you're going to make the jump to EPMA. So here are some pros and cons for EPMA versus Classic. Really, it's mostly going to be just pros, really. EPMA allows you to develop a central repository for your dimensions that can be shared with other EPM apps. With the Classic applications, you can only use those dimensions within that application. EPMA also has a data synchronization feature which allows you to transfer data as well as, this basic metadata integration. Classic does not have this feature, but you can use load rules, and if you're on a really old application, you might be using HAL, and you can also use ODI and other tools, but this is something that you would have to customize and build yourself. For automation, EPMA does come with a batch client, which allows you to automate the process of updating your metadata. Classic applications, there's no real automated process other than these custom tools. EPMA, you can integrate it with DRM, but you cannot do that directly in Classic. Again, that would be a custom process. You can also integrate ODI with Classic, but there is no direct integration with EPMA. Business rules with Classic applications, you can use the business rules that you created within the business rule module if you are on a release that is prior to release 11.122. After that, you must use Calc Manager even for Classic applications. If you are using EPMA, regardless of what version you are on, you are required to use Calculation Manager for a business rule. So here's some pros and cons for EPMA versus DRM. So DRM is Data Relationship Management, which is another metadata tool provided by Oracle. With DRM, you can share over many applications, including ERPs and legacy systems. With EPMA, that is only for EPM applications. The validation rules with DRM are very powerful. It allows you to make sure that certain properties are consistent across the members within your application, such as if all the children of a certain member need to be tagged in a planning application as an asset, it can make sure that that validation rule is not violated. There's no such sort of validation rules within EPMA, so there actually can be, a lot of room for human error in EPMA. DRM is more flexible in terms of using properties in order to have what to include and what to exclude within an application. Within EPMA, you can only use an exclude function, and with that, you can exclude branches or members from being part of the application versus what is in the shared library. With DRM, the integration is more robust. It can be used for mapping. Also, which is a really good use case of DRM. For example, if you are transitioning from an old chart of accounts to a new chart of account, that is a great use of DRM. But with EPMA, you don't have any of those kind of mapping capabilities. With DRM, you also can use properties in order to determine things like the sort order. But with EPMA, you cannot really specify the sort order other than like clearing out everything and reloading it, so it's in the order of the file that you are loading. With DRM, there is an additional cost to licensing DRM, but with EPMA, it's actually included in the EPM suite, and so there's no extra cost for that. DRM, because it's a more advanced tool, does require additional skills and resources that have that skill set, but EPMA is very easy for Hyperion administrators to learn, or really, it's very simple. So the architecture for planning applications, for example, is that a classic application, the application is created within planning, and the metadata is also updated within planning, and then there's a push between planning and Essbase when the metadata is refreshed. With EPMA applications, the application itself is actually created in EPMA, and then it's deployed to planning. The metadata is updated in EPMA and then deployed as planning as well. And the sequence of events is the updates from EPMA are deployed into planning, and then planning refreshes the Essbase application. So for DRM, the database can be created in either planning or EPMA, or actually even Essbase Studio if you wish. The metadata is maintained in DRM and then can be pushed to EPMA and then to planning or directly to planning. The benefit of going through EPMA is that you're able to use the EPMA Batch Utility to automate this whole process. But if you are using EPMA with DRM, my personal recommendation is that all the dimensions be local to the application and that you do not use the shared library, because that just adds a level of complexity that's not really necessary. In this case, DRM is really your source of your metadata, so this would be the easier approach. So the option, for example, for a planning application is to maintain your metadata in DRM and then push that to EPMA and then to planning in Essbase, or if you choose to skip the EPMA step, you can go from DRM to planning to Essbase, but that integration between DRM and planning you would need to build yourself, versus if you go through EPMA, you can utilize the processing and the batch processing that's already built by Oracle. So here are some design considerations. If you're, for example, implementing HFM and Hyperion and you want them to share the same dimension, there are some considerations with this, as some of the functionality is different between HFM and planning and Essbase as well. For example, in HFM, you cannot include spaces in the member names, but in planning you can do that. So if you need to share that metadata, you need to update things so that you don't have spaces in your member names. Instead, you can use aliases to make it be more user-friendly for those names. In HFM, the years are, for example, 2002, 2013, for example, and planning it uses the FY, so it's FY12, FY13, etc. So the design here is just different. So the recommendation here is that since planning must be FY12 and HFM must be like 2012, that you utilize aliases for planning in order to have it be 2012, 2013, so you have that consistency in the alias, between the alias in planning and the member name in HFM, which will make it a little bit easier for the users when they're using SmartView and other tools. Within HFM, the member names only need to be unique within the dimension, versus like in planning and Essbase, you really generally will only have the member names must be unique across all dimensions, and that's also true of the aliases as well. So the recommendation here is to make any changes to HFM so that there is uniqueness across all the dimensions. And also, I've noted here too that another thing that you would want to review is your naming conventions between the different applications and reserved words, because there also may be some issues there where maybe something will work in HFM but not in planning. Some other items here are the use of an alias table. Depending on what version of planning you're on, some of the functionality does not work unless you're using the default alias table. Traditionally, HFM uses the English table. But again, depending on the release, the recommendation here would be to have HFM also use the default alias table. In HFM, you can have dynamic account types where there's a formula in an account, as you can in planning and Essbase. However, in HFM, you cannot put formulas that are dynamic on parents, versus that is something that you can do in planning and Essbase. So the recommendation here would be to not put those type of formulas on parents, so that you can have that consistency and share your metadata. In HFM, you have consolidation operators that will give the flag of an asset, will flag it as like revenue, expense, asset, liability, or equity. In planning and Essbase, there are consolidation operators like pluses and minuses as you add up the hierarchy. And there are also account type flags, so that functionality is split into these two features. So in order to reconcile data as you're, like if you're upgrading from classic applications and integrating the applications and upgrading to EPMA, some ideas here about how to reconcile data is first to make sure that all the planning account types are the same as HFM. And secondly, reconcile for any differences there. And then in the data, and then change the planning consolidation operators as needed so that the numbers in planning when you're loading actuals agree with what's in HFM. As far as hierarchies go, HFM typically has a legal hierarchy, but may also have a management reporting hierarchy and other hierarchies. In planning, and you typically would have a management hierarchy, but not the legal hierarchy, although in some cases you may have both. Essbase tends to be used for reporting, so it typically would have all the hierarchies for all the applications. So one thing to keep in mind, though, with planning is that the first hierarchy of planning is the only one that can be used if you're using attributes and forms. And also ASO for Essbase has the stored hierarchy must occur first. And another aspect of this is that planning, the shared hierarchies must come after the stored hierarchies. So like if a member is used in both the first hierarchy and the second hierarchy, the first one is stored, must be stored for planning, and the second one would be shared. This kind of rule is not enforced in HFM, so you'll have to make sure that HFM does utilize this rule. So some recommendations here are that if you are starting a new project and you're planning on using EPMA, my recommendation would be not to start off as classic and then upgrade later. Some projects are run this way just because they think it's faster to develop in classic than it is to develop in EPMA. However, as you can see from the previous discussion, there's a lot of design considerations that would require a lot of rework if you take that approach. And that rework could be considerable. It may mean, changing member names so that HFM, planning, and Essbase can all integrate correctly, which could mean that you have to update forms and business rules and calculations and all kinds of things. So I really do recommend that if you're going to go the route of using EPMA, and this is a new project, that you start by using EPMA from the get-go. For production processes, you may wish to perform a first kind of dry run in a development or test environment, especially if your metadata changes are pretty complicated. And you may do things like moving, say, something that is a level 0 member and moving it to be a parent and have other children. Those kind of processes can be very complex because you have to make sure the metadata is correct and that the aggregation still gives you the correct numbers. So I would recommend that in those very complex environments or even moderately complex environments that you first run the process through a dev or test environment in a sort of automated way where you automate the load and then you stop and then you do manual verification steps and then you complete pushing it through to like planning and Essbase. You do this all in a dev or test environment, make sure everything is working properly, and then you can run a full automation of the whole process on production. So moving into the shared library and local library discussion. To access the shared library from Workspace, you would navigate to Navigate Administer Dimension Library. The shared library will appear on the left-hand side of your screen. And the shared dimensions and shared members have to be created in the shared library first before they can be shared within other applications like Planning, Essbase, or HFM. So the shared library is really the source of everything that's going to be shared across your EPM applications. So as you navigate from Administer to Dimension Library, you would see the shared library here with all the different dimensions listed. The local library, to access an application's local library, you would navigate to Navigate Administer Application Library here. And from there, you will see all the different applications, and they will be displayed as icons. You can right-click on them and go Edit in order to edit those local applications, or you can simply double-click it. So then what will happen is on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the local application that you're working with all of its different dimensions. And over here you can see like this dimension here, accounts is local, alias is shared. These other dimensions are local at this point. So your shared library on the left and the local library for the particular application that you're working with on the right-hand side. So if you're working with local members, it's only going to, and local dimensions, it's only going to make changes to that one application. So dimensions within an application can actually be local or they can be shared, one or the other, but you cannot have like one dimension be a combination of part of it from a shared dimension and part of it as local. It's either all or nothing, with the exception that you can make a dimension within an application come from the shared library and you can exclude pieces of it if you want to. So within an application, the dimensions may be a combination of shared or local, depending on what works for that particular environment. For example, if, say, cost center is only used within planning and no other application, well, then you might as well make that local. But if your, say, entity dimension is used across your applications, well, then you should make that part of the shared library so it updates all the impacted applications. Shared dimensions will be updated when any changes are made in the shared library for the applications that contain that dimension and have it marked as shared when you deploy the application. And you can choose when to deploy each application. You don't have to deploy all the impacted applications at the same time. A shared dimension needs to be created in the shared library before you can use it as a shared dimension in any application. And it's possible to use a shared library dimension and exclude portions of it. We'll show you how to do that a little later in the presentation. Local dimensions can only be updated within the local library for that single application. So in order to add your shared dimension to your local library for the application that you're working with, you can simply drag it and drop it over. So you just pick up this dimension here and drag it over. Once you have done that, you'll get this pop-up box which asks whether you want to make it local or shared. There may be some cases where you want to make it local, where let's say there is a dimension in the shared library that you can utilize for this application as kind of a starting point, but there's significant differences, so you can't actually share it. You can kind of use that as a quick start to set up a local dimension for that specific application. You can also, within the dimension library, copy a dimension from the shared library to another application that will copy it as a local dimension. And to do that, you just right-click on the dimension, click the Copy Dimension To, and then click the application. And the next screen will actually give you another pop-up box that asks you for the dimension name, description, and which application you want to copy it to. You can also change a local dimension to a shared dimension. So to do that, you would just go to the local library for that application, right-click on the dimension, and click Share Dimension. After you've done that, you can choose to merge it or replace it from what is in the shared library. And then when you've done that, you'll see that it's shown as shared. In order to do the opposite, to go from a shared to a local dimension, you would right-click on the right-click process above. You would just choose Detach Dimension. Okay. To exclude members, like if you have, I like to design applications with HFM so that a whole branch of the dimension is for, say, planning only. Those would be things like drivers, or maybe there's, for Essbase reporting, maybe there's some KPIs that you may use in reporting in Essbase and or planning, but maybe you don't have those in HFM. So I'll build like an alternate hierarchy with those members underneath it. So it's very easy to say exclude those from HFM, or the opposite, you know, I'll build a branch for things that are used in HFM that you want to exclude from like your planning or Essbase application. So first, you know, structure your dimension so that it's easy to exclude, because you can exclude a whole hierarchy or certain members, but rather than cherry picking, it's a lot easier to actually make your hierarchy support the ability to exclude. So in order to do that, you just right-click on the member name and within the dimension on the local library, and you choose to exclude that member or that hierarchy. If you have both Essbase BSO and Essbase ASO applications, you need to either build your formulas and properties either for BSO or ASO, and then you need to override those formulas and properties for the other Essbase type. And you can do that in the local library for the application where you need to do overwrites. Unfortunately, this is kind of a little thing with EPMA where it doesn't support both BSO and Essbase ASO applications in the same environment as well as you might like. So the members themselves will be shared, and aliases come across well. It's just things like formulas where there's a different syntax between BSO and ASO, and some of the properties might be a little bit different as well. So the next piece of the agenda is loading metadata. So we're going to, in this section, talk about creating a flat file, creating a profile, and then loading the metadata. There are other ways of doing loads. You don't have to do flat files. You can also do interface tables or DRM. But in this example, we're going to be using flat files. So the file format consists of the sections and columns. The order of the sections matter, but the columns can be in any order. The flat files will contain columns for things like the dimensions, the dimension associations for things like attributes, member information, hierarchies, and various properties. The beginning of a section has an exclamation mark that is followed by the section name, and then a single apostrophe will define the new column structure for each section. And the file format, you can either use semicolons, commas, pipes, spaces, or tabs. My preference is pipes. Semicolons I do not recommend because semicolons are used in planning and Essbase formulas. I think traditionally HFM would use like a semicolon delimiter or a comma delimiter, but that does not work well for planning and Essbase. So my preference would be pipe because your aliases and will never really use that kind of a indicator. So here's an example of loading the file format for loading a custom dimension. In this case, it's a customer. So first we have the file format given. In this case, it's ADF. So you can also make it TXT. I prefer TXT. Traditionally, with HFM, the files are always ADS, but it's just a lot easier to open in text because you can just click on it and open up in a text editor instead of having to kind of specify what program you're using to open it. The next section here is on dimensions. So it will give the name of the dimension. In this case, it's customer. What type of dimension is. In this case, it's a generic. So custom dimension would be called generic. And then the other information here about the storage for the dimension and such. So every item here will match up with the row here. When you see all these pipes here, it just means that that particular item was not being filled out. Either it wasn't used or you could just accept the default by not specifying. And then we get into the associations. In this case, we're making an association with the alias for the customer. And then this is really the crux of this particular file where we're actually loading the members. So we have the parent, followed by the child, the data storage property, which in this case is stored data, and then all the other information. So in this case, we're saying whether for planning if it's valid with which different plan type, etc. This example here shows loading up an attribute association. This would be for like a planning application or Essbase. So we were saying how the legal entity is an attribute of entity. Otherwise, the format is pretty similar. Accounts tend to be the most difficult to load because there's so many different account properties. We have, account types, what we are using for aggregation, what the storage method is, time balance, whether to skip values, all these variance reporting things, so all these kind of selections that you would do in planning. So the format just matches this line here, which is there's wrapping on these text files, so this wrapped onto these two rows, and then the root member and then the other members. And just like traditionally, the parents need to come before the child in these records in order for the metadata to load properly. The next step after you have your flat file is to create an import profile. So from Workspace, you go to the Dimension Library under Navigate, Administer Dimension Library. And once you are there, you would then go to File, Import, Create Profile. You'll be prompted to give a profile name and what type of an import it is, a description if you wish to enter one, and then you choose whether you want to load it into the Dimension Library for a specific application or the shared library. If you are selecting a flat file, you need to browse to a file that has the appropriate format. And if you're loading into the local library, you need to choose the actual data source. Next, you'll enter the various properties of the file, such as what the delimiter is for the file. And then you would map the various profile dimensions. So in this case, we're loading up alias and center. And you would choose whether you want to load this file as merging this information with what is already there or replacing all of the information with what is in this file. There are other mapping options here. So you'd want to make sure that the ones that you need to load are all selected here. Next, you would actually load this file. This example is showing loading it manually, so you would navigate from Workspace to Navigate, Administer, Dimension Library, and then select File, Import, Import Dimensions. You select the dimension you want to import and the type of import. And again, if you're selecting flat file, you need to actually browse to that file. And then once that's complete, you select Import. The next steps would be just to check the job console to make sure that the load completed without errors, or if there were errors, open up the text file to see what those errors are so that you can correct it. And then you would deploy the application. So that deployment would be to deploy from EPMA to Planning or Essbase or HFM. And following is some information on the EPMA Batch Utility. So the EPMA Batch client can import the metadata using profiles, and it will also do the deployment of the application to Planning or Essbase or HFM. Here's an example of what that batch call script would look like, and the various script here shows some examples of what the scripting would look like, but this is just an example. I can't guarantee that this would work. It really depends on the version that you're on as well. That's my little disclaimer. So here are some other tips. I recommend that you validate and deploy frequently from EPMA because there are certain things that you might do where it won't do things actually the correct way. For example, if you rename a member and then rename it again, or you do something like you rename a member to something that you just deleted, it can get a little confused. So it's a good idea to validate and deploy frequently, and in those instances that I just spoke about, do the first step, deploy, and then do the second step. It's also important to rename any custom dimensions before you deploy for the first time, as you cannot update those names of those dimensions later. As I spoke about before, my recommendation would be to use pipe delimited files, or if you wanted to, tab delimited would also be all right. But semicolon and comma are not a good idea for planning in Essbase. It will mess up your formulas. Also, for planning, you need to deploy workforce planning and or capital asset planning during the initial app creation. And first, I would recommend, as you're loading your various hierarchies, that you first load your stored hierarchies and you verify it, and then secondly, you update the shared hierarchies. In order to upgrade from Classic to EPMA, you can upgrade from Classic to EPMA using the Financial Management Class Administration, the Planning Class Administration, or also Essbase. So there's wizards in order to do the upgrade. Once you've upgraded a Classic application to EPMA, you cannot go backward. So that's an important thing to note. However, I do have some little tricks at the end of the presentation that I'll show you to kind of get around that. In a development environment, I would first recommend you remove any spaces in the names of attribute members because that'll cause an issue. Make sure that the Financial Management Application Server has IIS installed. Ensure all your users are logged out. Complete the upgrade process by going through the wizard. What will happen in that case is that all the dimensions at this point will be set to local. Then the next thing to do would be to integrate your metadata across your various applications, utilizing the shared library and exclusions as you need to, and any overrides that you may need to do for specific application metadata. This whole process of integrating your applications may also require you to update forms, formulas, business rules, etc. For example, when we talked about earlier about the various differences between member names and things between HFM and Planning and Essbase, so that may require you to make some kind of a change. You also have to change other objects. And you'd want to validate both your metadata and your data, and make sure that even things like your business rules run without errors, because of any member name changes. You want to make sure they rules validate and your calc scripts validate. So what I'm trying to get across here, too, is that this is not necessarily trivial. It is pretty trivial to actually upgrade the application where all the dimensions are local, but integrating your applications You do need to plan for that and do all of these steps to integrate HFM with planning and Essbase for applications that have already been in production or development, where you've done a lot of work and now you need to integrate them. So the steps in order to migrate or upgrade a classic application to EPMA, you would from Workspace go to Navigate, Administer, and then transform Classic to EPM Architect. And you'll go through this set of items. First, you get this little welcome screen. Just click Next, and then the next thing you want to do is to select which applications you want to upgrade. Then you review the summary page and click Finish. After you do that, you'll be taken over to the Job Console. So this is a print screen, shows you what the Job Console looks like for EPMA. You can also see a summary of items. You can see down here, for example, what the process, how long it's been running, how far it is going, whether it's completed or not. You'll see the status up here, so you can keep refreshing the screen until it is complete. So while you cannot go from EPMA back to Classic, you can export the metadata. For example, this is a trick for planning. I assume that there's like something similar for HFM. You can then export the data as Classic using the setting, and then use LCM in order to export it, and then use that export to create a new application that has like all the same things. So this particular setting is not really something that Oracle would support, but it is something that you can use temporarily in order to get this export in the kind of Classic format. The planning setting is called Edit Dim Enabled, so you would just add that setting to planning with the property of true, and then you would need to stop your planning service and restart. Once you've taken and exported the metadata, you would switch back to Classic by removing that setting and restarting the planning service again. This can be used to create a new application as a Classic application in case you want to go from EPMA back to Classic. And you could also use this as an export for PBCS or EPBCS, which does not support EPMA but would need the metadata in Classic format. So that's my presentation for today. I just wanted to thank everyone for attending.